What's up everyone, welcome back to the channel and to another 3D model. This week, I got a quick one for you. We are going to be making a guard tower. And this isn't any regular guard tower, this is an Area 51 guard tower. So, without further ado, let's just get started. Now, I really wasn't sure what I wanted to create for this week. Like usual, I feel like the last few weeks or months have been crazy busy, and this week was no different. I really didn't have a lot of time, so I wanted to make something that would be fairly quick and pretty straightforward. So while looking online, I came across this reference photo of a prison guard tower. And I really liked the idea. I thought it was cool, it was really interesting to look at, and I thought it'd be a lot of fun to recreate into a 3D model. So that's exactly what we're going to be doing in this week's video. We're going to use this reference as our main reference photo and inspiration, and we are going to recreate it as a 3D model. And I'm going to change it up a little bit. Instead of making a prison guard tower, this one's going to be based on Area 51. It's basically going to be the exact same thing, but I thought it'd be fun to make a more interesting take on the whole reference photo and add some Area 51 posters or signs on the front gate. Now, like I said, I really don't have a lot of time, so we're gonna simplify a lot of these shapes. We're gonna make this as quick as possible. We're gonna try to get through this in just a few hours. So the first thing to do was start with proportions. I needed to figure out how big everything was going to be, so I started with blocking out all those main shapes and figuring out how tall or big I wanted my tower to be. Now, to be honest, this took a little bit more time than I thought. My brain just wasn't working that well today, and I just had to play around with these shapes to figure out how big I wanted the whole structure to be. And as you'll see, once I start figuring those out, we can start moving on to more interesting things like all the little components on the tower. Now, to make everything a little bit quicker as well, I'm just going to focus on one side of the tower. So all those support beams on the bottom, I'm just going to really focus on just building one side. And once I figure out how big I want all of those beams to be, we can simply go ahead and duplicate them to all the other sides of the tower. Now, don't forget, you can find this full video in real time, along with the full UV mapping process and all the 3D working files. So if you're interested in seeing the 3D model, or you want to see the Substance Painter working file, you can find it all on my Patreon page, which will be linked in the description below. And also, if you really enjoy these types of videos and you want to see more random 3D models on this channel, please consider subscribing to it or liking this video. It goes an extremely long way in helping support my channel. And if you want to help out in an even bigger way, my Patreon page is by far the best place to do that. Now, one thing I did want to point out, if you wanted to make this more of a game-ready asset, there's a few extra corners we could have cut to make this more optimized. Now, of course, I wasn't optimizing this for a video game or anything like that, but there are a few things like the roof, for example. I added a bunch of edge loops to make it all dented to add all that little bumpy effect. Now, that can simply be done through the materials in Substance Painter. As well as the barbed wire, I really didn't try to cut back on polys too much when it came to all those little tiny sharp pieces on the barbed wire, but there's a lot of areas that you could cut back on polys just to make it more efficient for a game engine. Now, like I said, we're just making this one for fun. I wanted to make a really quick asset, so we're not going to try to optimize it, but it is something that I wanted to point out just before we get too far into the video. Now, I'm not going to lie, I wish there were a few extra elements I could have added to this model, and if I had more time, I definitely would have added these. Some of them being another portion of the barbed wire fence. I was originally thinking of just duplicating one of these little portions of fence over to the right and adding a little booth on the front of it with a little like guard little gate. That way it was like some sliding gate that could open to let people into this facility. And it would also be cool to add another row of barbed wire fence behind this tower, as if there's like two rows of protective fence. Since it is Area 51, I'm sure it would be pretty heavily secured rather than just one little row of metal fence. So I wish we could just add a few more elements to it, and that's one thing that I wasn't originally planning to add to it, but like I said, I just ran out of time. And also, looking back, I wish I added a few extra elements to the tower itself. I feel like it would have been cool to add one of those reflective little circle things on the corners, so you can, basically it's like a big mirror, like a half sphere, that just kind of shows you the area around the tower from inside. And I wish I also added a few extra pieces like some satellite dishes, or maybe some extra antennas or some more wire hanging around, just to make it look a little bit more busy and a bit more fun to look at. Now, these are all ideas you could do if you're recreating this model, so I would just recommend adding a few more fun elements to it. Just make it look a little bit more complex, like it's a high security tower. Now, like I said, I just simplified a lot of these shapes. So for example, those security cameras, they're just simple rectangles with a few cylinders on the end. But of course, we could have made these a bit more complex looking with more mechanical components involved. Just once again, make it a little bit more interesting and a bit more realistic. But that being said, this one was honestly a lot of fun to make. As some of you may know, I'm a really big UFO alien fan, as funny as it is to say, but I love the whole topic, and recreating an Area 51 guard tower was really fun to recreate. And fun fact, I actually went and visited Area 51, not actually inside the facility, but I drove out to Nevada a few years ago and went right up to the front gate, which was really intimidating and fun to experience. So if any of you are flying through Nevada and you go down extraterrestrial highway, I definitely recommend it. It was a load of fun and I definitely want to go back in the future. All right, so enough of me talking. Let's just continue blocking out these main shapes and let's slowly piece together our Area 51 guard tower. Alright, so before we jump into those UVs, I just quickly want to give a shout out to this week's video sponsor, PCBWay. PCBWay offers a variety of services ranging from PCB production, sheet metal fabrication, injection molding, 3D printing, and much more. You can quickly upload your own files and get a quote immediately. So if you're building something at home or want to print one of your own 3D models, PCBWay makes it extremely easy to get custom parts for your projects, even if you don't have the necessary tools. They take care of everything so you can get those parts shipped directly to your front door. So if you're working on a project or need 3D printing or any of these other services, make sure to check them out in the description below. And once again, thank you PCBWay for sponsoring this week's video. Alright, so here is the Prison Tower, or Area 51 Tower, in its finished form. So what I decided to do was break this thing up into 3 different groups for the 3 different textures applied. Why 3 textures? There's no specific reason. To be honest with you, it was just a lot easier for me just to make everything a lot quicker, just to split them up into 3. But to be honest, I could have condensed this definitely down to 2 textures. My original plan was to make 1 texture for the tower and 1 for the fence, but I decided to split the tower into 2 different textures for all the small objects. So we'll go over that in 2 seconds. But as you can see, everything is basically the exact same. I went ahead and just duplicated the security cameras from this side over to this side. And I went ahead and also combined all of my barbed wire. That way I can just use a soft select brush to just very subtly change the shapes. And so perfect. I just wanted to basically bend it up a little bit in certain areas. I made it very subtle, didn't want it to look too broken since it is a functional security gate, but it feels too uniformed. I thought it just didn't look that realistic, so I just very subtly just kind of gave them slight bends to the barbed wire. But other than that, everything is basically the exact same. So like I said, broke it up into 3 different groups. So let's take a look at these UVs. Let me open up my UV editor. So for the very first group is basically the main tower shape. So if I isolate this, you can see it's the main structure of my tower. And like I said, I probably could have done a better job with the UVs when it came to optimizing all of my UV space. I have a little bit of wasted space here. I could have enlarged some of these shells to get more resolution out of those materials, but it is what it is. I tried to get through this video as quick as possible this week since it is a busy week. So just something I wanted to point out. One of the biggest things I probably could have done just by looking at it quickly was move these bottom ones. So for example, what I could have done is just move these to other spaces in here like this. And then I could have just taken all of these objects, which is my walls, which are pretty important, and probably could have enlarged those even bigger and fit them in something like this and slid all these over. So there's little things you can do just to get more resolution out of those textures. Of course, textile density is important, and you don't want every shell to be different sized, but I like to always give proportions or the priority to the larger UV shells in my scene. So for example, the walls are pretty large, and I want the detail on these walls to be more important than, for example, these beams on the bottom of the tower. So the larger your shell is, the more pixels it has to work with, which means basically more resolution you're going to get out of those materials, especially if you're planning to add words. So if I was planning to add like small scratches or tiny like printed words on here, it's going to look less pixelated if the UV shell is a lot larger. So that's just something I like to keep in mind when I'm trying to plan out how I want my UV shells to be laid out. Now, to also save some space, I did stack a lot of my shells. So for example, all these top roof pieces are all sharing the same UV space, as well as these side panels. Now this is something I changed at the last minute. I ended up actually moving one of these shells up here, just that way. Long story short, I basically had some signs here with the numbers on each side, and I added just like a tiny rust. Basically right below these signs, I went with my brush in Substance Painter, I added some rust around the outside edge. And because they're not perfectly aligned on both sides, this one's not as centered as this side is. You can see the other lines like over here because they were just copying from one side to the other. So I ended up moving these shells over just to basically, like I said, you wouldn't see that rust pattern and it'd be more unique on each side. But everything else is the exact same. I did rather than overlapping my windows, I decided to just move those to their own separate UV space. That way they would just be more unique window patterns. I was planning to have more grunge on these windows, and then I realized it'd be kind of cool to make them a little bit more reflective since it is a security tower. You probably, I mean, when I went to Area 51 to the gate, everything was mirrored windows, so you actually couldn't even see through them, which is really interesting. And I was going to do that with this tower, but I just thought it didn't look as interesting. I thought it looked kind of strange having mirrored windows on here, so I just made them a little bit more transparent in Substance Painter. So I was originally planning to do something a bit different with them. That's why they are all separated. But it's pretty straightforward. Another thing I actually decided to stack were my roof pieces as well, these metal pieces, since you're basically never going to see the exact same side more than once, just two sides basically at once. If you're looking at the tower, you really wouldn't be able to see too many repeating patterns. Now I probably could have separated two of these, so I probably could have separated like these two to their own space. That way I could add a bit more interesting rust pattern on the roof. And originally I was actually planning to do that, and when I applied a material to it, I just saw you can see a simple like repeating pattern on this exact same spot. So I decided to keep the grunge and the dirt fairly simple on the roof to avoid seeing those repeating patterns. So sometimes you have to work around it, but it is what it is. Also, something I just noticed that I did add, using that soft select brush, I decided to also bend my tower a tiny bit, just to make it a bit more interesting. So when you're looking at it straight, like these ones, they're a little bit very subtly warped and bent, just to hopefully make it look more realistic, just so it's not so straight and so perfect. But that is the very first group. All right, and then the second group is the front fence. And this one's very straightforward as well. Just to simplify the whole process for myself, I decided to break the fence into its own texture group. But as you can see, all of the fences are all sharing the exact same UV space. These ones, of course, are separated just because the sizes are different. I didn't want them, I guess I could have stacked them as well, but I decided to break these off their own space. But separated the fence, and all of these bottom pieces are all sharing the same UV space. And then all my barbed wire, all these little poles as well, are all stacked. Since you wouldn't be able to see too much detail on them, I thought just saving space. And then all my barbed wire, I honestly didn't even UV my barbed wire. I just left these. As you can see, I did a very simple job, since you're never gonna see them extremely up close. They're not even like sharp, they're like little blocked out cube kind of shapes. But because you're seeing it always at a distance like this, it still looks like pointy, sharp objects. And I just rushed it at the very end, so I just didn't even UV them, since they're gonna be simple, just some metal applied to it, some shiny material. It doesn't really need to be detailed. Now, of course, that is a lazy thing I did. You probably could have done a better job just before since I used mesh to basically duplicate all these little tiny objects along my curve. I probably should have just UV'd one ahead of time before actually using that mesh tool. Since I didn't do that, I didn't want to go back and redo it, so I just decided to use this as is. And like I said, it's so small, you honestly wouldn't be able to notice if it was UV'd or not, so I just made my life a little bit easier with that one. And once again, I probably could have enlarged some of these just to take a bit more advantage of my UV space, but I was really rushing at the end just to move on to the texturing, so I decided to simplify it. All right, and the very last group is everything else in my scene. Now, I did move some objects out last minute, so that's why there is a piece missing right here, because I originally did have another cylinder, and I think I moved it to another UV group, but that's why this one's really doesn't look as laid out as I usually make them. I'm always talking about really condensing your space to take advantage of that empty real estate you have here. I mention that in almost every YouTube video. Well, this one looks a little bit sporadic. Some empty spaces, a lot of empty spaces. And that's the reason why I was just moving some stuff around last minute. I didn't bother to come back and actually rearrange these to enlarge them. So, you know, that's something that I would probably do if I had a bit more time. But just to also save myself time, all the objects that are duplicated are all just sharing the same UV space. So all these little signs with the numbers are all sharing the same UV space. All these security cameras, the lights, it just makes my life a lot easier when I'm applying materials in Substance Painter rather than having to texture each individual camera. I can just texture one and they're all textured together. Same with all these little metal pieces on this, they're all sharing the exact same UV space. And all my steps, for example, they are all sharing the same UV space. So just once again, makes life a lot easier. And like I said at the beginning, I very easily could have just gone back and combined this texture group with this one and had just one texture UV set for my tower itself. I feel like since there's so much empty space on this one and this one, I could have just easily rearranged the shells to make it work. But once again, I know I keep saying it, I had to rush this one a little bit. So just wanted to point that one out ahead of time. I feel like you can do a better job if you're going to recreate it yourself. But that's how I basically prepared my tower. So now I just need to apply different material to each group. I can go ahead and export my security tower and we can jump over to Substance Painter and we can start our texturing. All right, now jumping over to Substance Painter, we can use that exported FBX, load it into Substance Painter, and bake out our textures. Now, when it came to the textures, honestly, it was pretty straightforward. I did a bunch of Googling to look up different security towers, and to be honest with you, they were very plain and fairly boring. Almost all the metal is just plain white. I even looked up Area 51 towers, and they were still plain white or plain gray. So I decided to kind of use the exact same idea and just keep everything very similar in color, but just make it look a bit more worn out and basically more dirt, more grunge and rust, as if it's sitting out in the desert for, years and years. It's a little bit dirty, it's not pristine, but I didn't want to add too much variation in color since, to be honest with you, they are pretty boring in real life. So I decided to use one main material. It's actually a preset, a plastic preset that comes with Substance Painter. I decided just to change those sliders, add more metallic to it to make it more of a metal rather than a plastic, and then just basically apply that to majority of my tower objects. And then once I have all of those main UV shells filled in with some sort of material, I can add different fill layers to add more grunge. I use a lot of smart masks to add more dirt and grunge on top of that material, just to make it once again look a little bit more worn out and beaten up. But this one was pretty straightforward, to be honest with you. It did not take too much time. One material that I did use was from the Substance Source website, and that's that chain link material. So I just jumped on the website, which you should be able to access for free if you're paying for Substance Painter, but it's just a simple chain link pattern, and I just decided to apply that to my chain link fence just to make that process very quick and easy. Now don't forget, if you want to see this full process in real time, or just want to see the whole UV mapping process or get access to the Substance Painter file, you can find that all on my Patreon page, which will be linked in the description below. All right, so let's just start filling in these empty meshes with some sort of material, and let's slowly start building up our guard tower materials. Now, once again, when it comes to texturing, I always find it can be very unmotivating at the beginning when everything's looking very plain and simple, but as you slowly work on it and you add more layers to it, more dirt and grunge, and it starts to look a little bit more interesting and more realistic. So it's one thing you just have to kind of just continue working at it, and the more you work at it, the better it will be. So just keep that in the back of your head. I feel like every time I'm starting a model, it's kind of overwhelming, or you start to get a little bit unmotivated because it looks fairly bad or it's just simple, but like always, if you just keep working at it, it just only gets better. So that's what we're gonna do here. We're just gonna slowly start building up those materials. We can put this texture together. Also, if you're not subscribed, please consider subscribing to the channel or check out my Patreon page. It will definitely help me out, and I would really much appreciate it. All right, let's start texturing our Area 51 guard tower. Alright, and that's everything. That's the whole 3D modeling, UV mapping, and texturing process that I did to create this Area 51 guard tower. I really hope you guys enjoyed this week's video. If you did, please hit that like button, and also please consider subscribing to the channel. And don't forget, you can find this full video in real time, which includes the full UV mapping process. And you can also get access to all the 3D model and working files. You can find it all on my Patreon page, which will be linked in the description below. And as always, I want to give a massive thank you to all my Patreons. I really can't thank you all enough for your continuous support, so just thank you for being here and supporting my work. Alright, let me know in the comments what you thought about this week's model, and I will catch you all in the next one.